assembly said that this is my the last time I'll be addressing you as Secretary General. And that was a kind of poignant moment.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Help Desk. I'm your host Drew, and this week we've got a newsy episode for you. We're going to break down what's going on in the news. It wasn't a week of Parliament, but it was the PAP's conference over the weekend that just passed. That is the 23rd and 24th of November. So joined with me to break it down and to explain what was going on. We've got Min. Hey Min.
Hello.
Could you be happier to be on the couch? On our nice Scanteak couch? No?
The couch is excellent.
And we've got a new face, Tharun, who you've never been on the podcast before. Welcome, Tharun.
Hello.
And the reason why you're joining us is because, apart from being very witty and very funny, you were also at the PAP conference reporting on it for Mothership.
Yeah, on the Sunday.
Yeah, on the Sunday, exactly. Okay, so let's get right into it. What was it like to be there on the ground, Tharun?
Well, I got there at so it was held at the Singapore Expo.
Yeah.
Got there at about 9:30 a.m. in the morning. And the first thing I saw was this massive sea of white, like floating into the expo halls.
Okay.
So I went and
What were you
along.
wearing?
I wasn't wearing white. I was wearing like a brown shirt and
good.
jeans. We went in and it was super crowded. And I think there were around 3,000 party members in attendance for the party conference. And then you go in and then there's like a huge security screening as well.
Everybody has to go through a security screening.
Yeah, everybody has to go through the security screening. And after that, there's like another huge hall where they have like coffee and drinks and snacks. I was a bit concerned when I went into the room because I already had these fully filled like cups of coffee and walking around. It was like, okay, everyone's dressed very nicely in white.
You're out of place.
Yeah.
But surely the other members of the media weren't wearing white either.
No.
That's for the sake of like neutrality and things like that.
Yeah,
right?
the media generally was dressed in black, that's why we could tell who was the media in the room. It's like everybody else was dressed in white that day. But there were people dressed in red because there were NTUC folk as well. I think it was about, I want to say about 30 people. I don't actually remember the number though.
Yeah. Okay, great. And then once the conference started on Sunday, what was that like? I went to the conference 2 years ago, the last one.
Yeah.
And it was, from what I remember, it was like a concert, but like PAP themed concert. Is that accurate?
Yeah, they had two MCs come out. It was like they were hyping up the event.
Uh-huh.
And the theme of the conference was PAP 70. So that was like the thing they emphasized.
The 70th anniversary.
70th anniversary, which was November 21st. So it was like, that they even had like a series of like panels outside outside the conference hall, which were like sort of bring a timeline of the PAP's history. Okay, yeah. And that was the first thing that they sort of emphasized, so like the theme of it. But yeah, there was a kind of like concert atmosphere to the conference.
Yeah, a lot of hype. Performances?
Yeah, no performances.
Okay.
But there was a lot of hype. It was, they were playing music and stuff like that.
Yeah.
The atmosphere, you also saw a lot of party members mingling and interacting with each other.
Yeah.
On the day. Yeah, it was quite striking for sure.
They had music. Were there any PAP cadres swaying to the music by any chance?
Not that I remember, but maybe.
Okay.
Maybe in the front rows.
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing that struck me when I was there looking at the crowd was, and this is just an observation, it seemed to be on the older side, like the people who were the party members and the cadres who were there. You did see some younger folk, some younger PAP members, some PAP folk who were like clearly in their 20s or 30s, but it generally was a crowd that was in their 40s and 50s. It connected with something that I think Prime Minister Lawrence Wong said during the speech, where he was talking about bringing people into the party. That like the big struggle right now for him is trying to find people to join.
Okay,
It seemed to connect. That observation connected with that moment in the speech. It was kind of interesting for me. I don't have the exact numbers, obviously, because it's a big question mark.
The age breakdown, you don't have.
I don't have that at hand or anything like that. But just visually, it did strike me when I was there at the party conference.
Maybe a few more gray hairs than none.
Yeah.
Okay, you talked about the speeches, but before we get into it, right? Maybe I can throw this to Min. What exactly is the PAP party conference?
PAP Party Conference is it kind of takes after sort of like a British style way of organizing political parties. I mean, if you're an observer of British politics, you see that every fall, every autumn, the parties will gather together and sort of like set out agendas for the next year, that kind of thing, renew leadership where necessary. Usually you don't really pay that much attention to them unless there's something really important coming up, like a general election or leadership transition, which, coincidentally is precisely what's happening here.
Yeah. This was SM Lee's last party conference as the Secretary General. I think he announced that he was stepping down.
Yep.
That's correct. He gave a speech. What was the mood like when he was giving the speech, Tharun? Maybe you can let us know.
I mean, the speech was fairly short. I mean,
Okay.
I think the speech was focused, as I remember it, primarily on the leadership transition, the fact that he's handing it over, and also on the upcoming general elections. That was a talking point in it. At the end of the speech, there was a huge standing ovation for SM Lee. I mean, he'd been there for 20 years, since 2004. That's when he took over as Secretary General. So I guess there was this mood of like looking back on the things he has achieved, and leaving his legacy as Secretary General. Yeah.
Did you see any like kind of reactions in the crowd or anything like that? Like, were people responding emotionally to his speech? Was it that kind of mood?
Yeah, definitely people were looking back on his career. I mean, there was applause. People were kind of reacting to the speech. I mean, I can't quite place. I mean, to be clear, like I was sitting at the back, the back of the crowd, so I can't see people's faces. All I see is like.
So if anyone was crying, you wouldn't be able to see it.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine that there's an emotional reaction to someone who's been stewarding the party for so long, saying that this is their last speech. There was one moment in the speech when SM Lee said that this is my the last time I'll be addressing you as Secretary General, and that was a kind of poignant moment. On that day, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's a massive moment. I still in my head sometimes still think of him as PM Lee. Like I have to correct myself instead of calling him SM. So it is kind of weird to think that he is not the Prime Minister. And Tharun, you're a bit younger than Min and I. I think you're still in your 20s. That's correct. You're like 25, 26, right?
26, yeah.
Yeah. So and he's been Secretary General for 20 years. Yeah. So as long as you can remember, he's probably been the Prime Minister. That is like a massive thing. It is rare to have someone in power for that long globally. Yeah. Did you guys find anything interesting about the speech? I mean, you mentioned like that poignant moment, Min. Did you have any reflections or thoughts on it?
There was a section of the speech where he sort of like doesn't quite mention a number of recent events in other countries. Okay. Where there has been sort of like interscene party factionalism.
He alluded to these things. Yeah.
I think it was quite obvious what he was referring to, although I think perhaps best not to say.
Okay, I mean, he didn't mention any names. He made maybe allusions, but having read his speech, having heard his speech, what were the kind of examples that come to mind, I guess, Min?
The best example is probably the Conservative Party in the UK. The Conservative Party had been in power for 14 years, which, it's kind of weird because we think about the UK as a place where, governments regularly switch parties. But the Tory Party was in power for nearly as long as SM Lee was in power himself. But in that time, they went through 5 different prime ministers. In the run-up to the most recent general election, there was constant talk about whether they should switch leadership. Yeah. I mean, the outgoing prime minister was essentially a dead man walking. So the talk during the entire election campaign was not whether he could win, but who would replace him when he inevitably lost. And the rhetoric within the party, never mind to the then opposition, was very heated and quite frankly, very toxic.
I think probably, the United States also comes to mind as another example that, he didn't state it explicitly, but it felt like an allusion was made to that moment when President Joe Biden withdrew from the election race and Kamala Harris took over for the candidacy. I mean, the point being that, you know, unlike in many countries around the world, the leadership transition here has been uneventful.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing. You know, we
Yeah.
don't have a huge, you know, there's not a lot of drama surrounding it. You know, it happened without, at least to our knowledge, any kind of tension.
You know, I can't think of any other country in the world where it is as uneventful as it is in Singapore. You know, like in the UK, we saw prime ministers change because the party just lost confidence in that leader.
Yeah.
So I find that kind of interesting, and I think, you know, there's something to be said about that drama-free transition. Probably a positive thing. He handed over to Prime Minister Lawrence Wong, who he also said he was going to recommend to be the next SecGen. So we expect that to be confirmed in the coming weeks. Prime Minister Lawrence Wong gave a speech. You know, what were you guys' thoughts on that speech?
So just before we move on, I think it should be pointed out that in terms of relatively drama-free, it occurs to me that this is actually one of the most drama-filled transitions that we've had. I mean, like, we have had a situation where Prime Minister Wong was not part of the initial group that was considered to take over. That of course went to DPM Heng Swee Keat.
Yeah.
And for various reasons, health and other things, was decided not to go ahead with that particular transition. So it should be pointed out that it is a relatively drama-free transition, not an entirely drama-free transition.
Okay, moving on to Lawrence Wong's speech.
Mm-hmm.
I always find it hard to say Lawrence Wong's speech. I don't know, like two S's in a row kind of feeling. What did you guys find interesting of the speech? And what was, maybe Tharun, you can start us off. What was the energy, the feeling in the room like when he took the stage?
I think there was a bit of excitement when he took the stage. I mean, people definitely were expressing their support behind. I mean, I think everyone kind of knew in the room that he's going to be the next Secretary General, even though it's not explicitly confirmed.
Okay.
But, you know, there was this kind of atmosphere of, I guess, excitement, anticipation for what he's going to say. And I mean, because it is also about the party's future. There's also stakes to his speech because it's, I mean, he's leading the new team into the general election next year. So, you know, there was a bit of sort of anticipation, I guess, like excitement about that. I mean, there's definitely that was definitely the mood going into the PM Wong speech. Yeah.
And was there anything in that speech that caught your attention, Min?
I mean, it was a general mood that occurred to me when I was listening to the speech that, I mean, prior to him becoming prime minister, like, and I'm talking about 18 months ago, there was a lot of discussion as to how the timeline of the transition would take place and whether then DPM Wong would be leading the party into the general election. And now there is no doubt he has clearly stuck his flag in the dirt and laid out what, you know, his intentions are. And it was sort of like a speech of remarkable confidence. He clearly has confidence in himself and his team to lead the party into the next election, which is, I mean, it's good for him. It's probably what the party faithful would want to hear, and it means that he will have to bear the responsibility for any outcome. He, you know, if things don't turn out well, it's on him. But he also gets to take full credit if things do turn out well. He doesn't really have to not put too fine a point on it. He doesn't have to like hide behind the coattails of those who came before him. He gets to, you know, he gets to take full credit for the ultimate result of the election.
Yeah, and that's especially important because, you know, it's the first election. He needs that mandate from Singapore. He needs to be able to govern with that mandate from Singapore, rather, or he would love to have that mandate from Singapore.
Absolutely,
and that legitimacy that he's not just the guy who came after PM Lee or SM Lee now, but he is, you know, his own man. He is his own leader as well.
And it possibly frees, like, if he exits the general election with a good, like a strong mandate, it frees him up to take bigger swings. Like, I mean, like as mentioned in both PM Wong's and SM Lee's speech, there are a number of domestic issues that concern Singaporeans. Housing is one. Cost of living is another. There are many ways of approaching these problems. Some are more incremental than others, but the possibility of larger reform or bolder reform probably is more enabled by a stronger mandate.
Yeah. Because if you have like a small margin of popular vote, you're probably thinking like, hey, do we want to rock the boat too much, right?
Yeah.
What I found interesting in his speech, and it was a theme that I remember from 2 years ago, the last time the party conference happened, was he had this thing that he was speaking about how some Singaporeans want to vote for the opposition because they just want more opposition, not necessarily because they want to change the government. But he kind of warned against this kind of attitude. Maybe, do you guys mind elaborating on that a bit more? Why do you think this was important for him to emphasize in his speech?
I mean, the electoral math in Singapore is a little bit more complicated than other first-past-the-post systems. Losses in single constituencies, not single member constituencies, but individual constituencies can result in relatively large swings.
Yeah.
So you don't just lose 5 MPs at once; you also lose potentially 1 or 2 ministers or ministers of state in a single go.
Yeah.
So
we saw that in Sengkang, right, in the last election, and then before that in 2011 we saw that in Aljunied as well.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
And I mean, Sengkang was particularly dense in terms of how many potential cabinet ministers they didn't make it into parliament.
One cabinet minister, Ng Chee Meng, who was minister in the Prime Minister's office, and then I believe other appointment holders, Amrin Amin and Lam Pin Min.
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, so it's a and I mean, there are multiple ways of looking at it. Like, is the majority necessarily at risk? Maybe not. But I mean, all these types of changes in government can happen incrementally. It is certainly a situation where I think many parties would want people to vote for the party they wanted.
Yeah.
As opposed to this sort of like, sort of like incremental kind of signaling and messaging that some people encourage voters to participate in. I mean, from a voter angle, it's not necessarily the wrong thing to do. I mean, if you want more opposition, you want more opposition voices, then, voting for them is the way to go about things. But I imagine that PM Wong's take on this is that if you want me to be your prime minister and you want my party to be the government, vote for us.
Yeah.
Don't chuck opposition votes. Don't chuck votes to the opposition just because you want to temper us a little bit. I think it must annoy all politicians in Singapore, this idea of split votes. You want the PAP, but you in Parliament in power, but you want the you want the opposition in your constituency.
Yeah.
Like it's just a basic call. Like, if you want us to be your government, then vote for us for your in government.
Just to add on to that point, I mean, the context for that is that the opposition has always claimed that they don't want to form a government.
Yeah.
So you'd basically be voting for an alternative voice in Parliament. You wouldn't be voting for the opposition to govern. This has been the this is what he's referencing when he says, there's no fear of an opposition wipeout. That's not a thing that's going to happen. So that's not something you should vote with in consideration of. But yeah, I mean, it's something that seemed quite familiar. Like, it's a thing we'd heard before. But of course it has renewed importance now because the general elections are coming around, and I guess for the Prime Minister getting a mandate is like the main priority for him at this point in time.
Yeah. That was, I mean, he kind of referenced the discourse, I guess, that on the ground before GE 2020, where there was a lot of people predicting that the possibility of a wipeout of opposition politicians. Obviously, we now know that didn't happen. In fact, they won another GRC. And I believe Pritam Singh has already said that they will not field enough candidates in the coming election to take government. So that has been like a strategy of the WP at least, right? That to field just enough so that you can have an opposition voice in parliament, perhaps deny the PAP a supermajority in parliament, but not enough so that you could actually form government.
And another thing that was significant to me in that speech was when he mentioned this idea that the PAP could no longer afford to stay in the background in this more, quote unquote, more contested political landscape. I mean, I don't know exactly how to read that. It's an interesting comment though. I think the idea being that the government has to be more proactive in engaging citizens, in engaging them on policies and explaining their point of view.
Yeah.
And this idea that the PAP quote unquote can no longer operate from the back. Yeah. So I don't know.
The back of what precisely?
Yeah. This is my question.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that speaks to sort of like an overlap between the personalities of the government and of the party. It is perhaps often that we think that they are one and the same, but I think events like the PAP Party Conference remind us that they are in fact distinct voices, or at least are meant to be.
Yeah. Well, what that does bring to mind for me is things like PM Wong's Forward Singapore exercise, going out and engaging the public and having these consultations about what the future of Singapore should look like, what we want Singapore policy, the government's policy to look like as well, what the changes people want to have made. We did see them introduce a new app, right? That they unfair to laugh, I think, but I mean that app, supposedly will be to engage Singaporeans as well. So I do suppose that does signal what he hopes his future government to be going forward after the next election, something that's a bit more consultative. I don't know if that's how you say the word, and perhaps something that views itself in partnership with the Singaporean populace rather than like telling them what to do. Which that's not to say that the previous governments have been like that, but perhaps there is a perception that governments of old have had that kind of attitude, whether or not that's the reality or not.
I wonder whether this speaks to sort of like a dichotomy between what people think that the PAP is doing versus what the PAP itself thinks it's doing.
Okay.
Like, I mean, whether people look at the party and the government and go like, yeah, you guys tell us what to do a lot, whereas the party kind of thinks like we could do more.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is. I mean, it is very different talking about the party and the government, depending on whether you're coming at it from their perspective or whether you're coming from it from the people's perspective. I think people on the ground, I think there's this general idea that information flow from the ground to the leadership is always tricky. But I wonder whether this comment from PM Wong kind of speaks to this idea that the party and the government is concerned that they are not getting their message down to the ground well enough as well, and so that there's this sort of like dissonance in interpretation of what government actions mean and what government intentions are. And I mean, like, I think not to harp too much on the U.S. presidential election, you kind of see this issue of there are a lot of things that the Biden administration say they did to help with cost of living, to help with inflation, to help. I mean, my personal favorite is the stuff that the head of the FCC, Lina Khan, has been doing to kind of make things fairer for consumers. to advocate more for consumers.
Yeah.
None of this comes out during the election campaign.
Yeah.
Nobody's talking about it. Whenever it comes up, you see all these people who did not vote for Biden-Harris, who basically said, wouldn't it be nice if Biden-Harris did this and that? And it's only a Biden-Harris appointee who's doing it. And so, like, I wonder whether the PAP look at situations like this and go, there is perhaps a problem where we are doing things and not getting credit for them, which, as I say it out loud, might not be that much of a problem in Singapore.
Okay, another thing that PM Wong mentioned in his speech that I want to bring up is a discussion about cost of living and how that might lead to anti-incumbency. Mm-hmm. Any thoughts that you guys had on that?
Yeah, I guess he's that there's an international context for why he was making this comment on cost of living and quote unquote anti-incumbency feeling. I think largely, we've seen this in other elections around the world. For instance, in Japan, in the United States, where cost of living was like one of the top reasons for voting against the incumbent party.
Yeah.
And that many have suggested that was one of the main reasons behind Kamala Harris's loss in the U.S. presidential election. So I think that's definitely going to be weighing on the ruling party's mind in Singapore as well.
Yeah, the gist of what he was saying was cost of living is a problem worldwide, not just in Singapore.
Exactly.
And that we've been trying to do things to mitigate the impact of that in Singapore, though, it's impossible because we are so exposed to global trade and global trends. Yeah, so I did think that was interesting. I guess he's kind of building like a defense against that argument that will be used against him perhaps by some opposition politicians in the coming election. Let's move on to talk about the CEC elections, because that is another big part of the party conference. They announced their new CEC. Okay, before we talk about that, for those who are unaware, what is the CEC in the first place?
So the CEC is it's the Central Executive Committee. It's the ostensibly 12 plus however many they decide to pull in members.
Up to 6.
Up to 6, yeah. But this time they only pulled in 2.
Well, they only pull in 2
so far
at the conference, and then they can announce more co-opted members.
As and when.
Yeah.
So I think the 2 they co-opt is like the 13th and 14th.
Yeah.
Votes.
Vote getters.
Yeah.
So they're voted by the cadres to be. This is like the central brain of the party. Is that fair to say?
I suppose you could put it that way. I think like a board of executives is another way of looking at it. It basically is it is exactly what it sounds like. It is the central leadership of the party. Singapore, the PAP in particular has social democratic roots, so that means that the party is organized in particular ways. One of the questions that was asked by a friend was, why is it a secretary general?
Okay.
And that is, why not like a chairman or president? Or
well, they do have a chairman.
Yeah, they do have a chairman.
Yeah.
But it's the secretary general that is the leader. And this is anecdotal. As I remember it, the reason why is mainly because the Secretary General in the early days of socialist and social democratic parties was the one who handled the recruitment of cadres, and therefore was politically best placed to win elections for party leadership, or exert but power over the rest of the party. And eventually they decided to just make it formal rather than implied. So you see a lot of other similar parties also led. I want to use inverted commas, but it's not inverted commas. It's actually led by the Secretary General.
Well, the WP, the Workers' Party,
yes.
Pritam Singh, the leader of the opposition, is the Secretary General of the WP. It is a funny title because on one hand it's like Secretary, on the other hand you're General, pretty badass. So the names of the new PAP, the 38th PAP CEC, the order I'm going to read them in is not according to the number of votes received, I must say. Lawrence Wong, Lee Hsien Loong, Heng Swee Keat, Chan Chun Sing, Masagos, Shamugan, Grace Fu, Desmond Lee, Edwin Tong, Indrani Raja, Ong Yi Kang, Vivian Balakrishnan, those are the 12, and then Chi Hong Tat and Tan Si Ling, they were co-opted as the two members who got the next highest amount of votes. And as we said, in the coming weeks, we're looking forward to the appointments of the CEC. So we expect Lawrence Wong to be appointed Secretary General, but I think what we're looking out for is who will be Assistant Secretary General, who will be the first and second Secretary General as well, who will be Chairman and Vice Chairman, Treasurer, Assistant Treasurer, and so on and so forth. They could also include new members who are co-opted into the CEC. The only new name in this list of 14 was Minister for Transportation Chi Hong Tat. What do you think that means for his position in the party, given that he's now elevated to its central, leadership?
Congrats to him, I suppose.
Congrats to you, Minister Chi.
Yeah. I mean, on the other hand, it's like more work, so maybe like a tempered congrats. I think it's a reflection of his more prominent position in the past year or so, having taken over as Minister of Transport, which is never an easy position. I mean, we were speaking about this a little earlier. Of all the points of friction between like people and like citizens and the government, you have healthcare, you have housing, and you have transport. Healthcare and housing are big points of friction, but they occur every once in a while.
Yeah.
If you're not satisfied with the transport system for whatever reason, you encounter that friction every single day, and it may be a small thing, but it's always there, and it's not easily fixable.
Yeah.
So it's not been an easy role. I think if you take a look at the history of the role since 2011, I think only Ong Ye Kung is the only minister who has moved from the Ministry of Transport to another ministry.
Okay.
Yeah, I oh my God. Depending on my memory is always a problem at best times. But yeah.
What happens after they retire or they
usually retire. They usually leave cabinet afterwards. I mean, one of the ministers Minister Liu Tak-yu is the most prominent one because he kind of endured the brunt of the post 2011 transport issues, where there were I mean, people think like the recent spate of breakdowns and stoppages were problematic, but there was a point of time in post 2011, I think 2012, 2013, where it was basically stopping every other week.
Yeah,
and it was consistent and grinding, and Liu Tak-yu was the minister in charge during that period when he was the one trying to make the fixes, and prior to him becoming Minister of Transport, I think it's fair to say that people expected a much longer political life. I think he did a fine job on the fixes to the transport system at the time, but it clearly was a very high stress role.
Yeah.
And he decided to leave not just cabinet but politics altogether after that. It came as quite a surprise in 2015 because it was the first. I remember it very clearly because that was the first general election I covered in professionally.
Yeah. To be clear, we don't know that he retired because he hated MOT or he found it tough.
I don't think I wouldn't say he hated it, but I think it, it was very stark, and he's not the and I mean he later went on to become ambassador to both China, first China, then the United States, or the other way around. I may have gotten that wrong, but which are not exactly low stress positions either. So so being transport minister for a year, not an easy role.
Yeah. I mean, just to round out that discussion on Minister Chi, quite a meteoric rise, I would say, from becoming Minister for Transportation in maybe not the most ideal circumstances, and then having to take on like quite a few problems. But I mean, now he's he has been elected to the party's top leadership. And I think that says a lot about his standing within the party, and also what Prime Minister Lawrence Wong thinks about him as well. Any last words that you guys had about the PAP Party Conference? Any last reflections before we wrap up?
Do you want to talk about the dancing on stage?
Maybe as a more general point, it seemed like another theme of the conference was this idea of like entering a world that's a bit more contested. A political landscape that's more contested. That was one point that was raised, but also, PM Wong had mentioned a new world, like the ending of an established world order, and some kind of new order taking place with the election of Donald Trump. With a new kind of geopolitical landscape, and so it's interesting to see, coinciding with the 70th anniversary of the PAP, the party conference as a time for reflecting on how the party has come, how far the party has come over the past, close to 7 decades, or 65 years in power, their current position and what they will look like in the future. So that seemed to be it seemed to be a fairly reflective and thoughtful conference in that regard.
Yeah. And I think that's all the time that we have, maybe all the attention span that we have from our audience to talk about these kind of nerdy things. I thank you guys so much for joining me and for breaking down the PAP Party Conference. I think we'll have you guys on again soon to talk about politics and news. What do you reckon? If you join us again?
Yeah.
How was the Scanteak couch? Was it comfortable?
Yeah, pretty comfortable.
Pretty okay. Cozy. Yeah, thank you to Scanteak for that couch. No, okay, so that's all that we have time for today. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll catch you guys in the next episode. And remember, this episode was powered by Audio-Technica. See ya.